Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to give a talk here. I'm really excited about this group and this workshop. I see this as something we need because soil carbon and carbon cycle itself is so complex and there is a lot of opportunity, but how you do it matters. And I'm hoping that my keynote talk is a little bit like an overview of things, what we know about the carbon cycle, how it influences, and what is its role in climate change mitigation, and I hope it provokes thoughts, and then we can discuss more. So I'm going to give you a little bit like kind of glimpses of here and there what we know about the carbon cycle and its role. So I'm first going to give a really brief introduction of climate change to just make sure that we are kind of on the same page, because it raises really interesting questions about the carbon cycle. I know that most of you know this already, but it's just a brief getting all of us to the same page. Then I'm going to discuss different kind of climate change mitigation strategies. And why do we care about carbon dioxide? And how can we use the natural or nature-based systems to actually influence the carbon cycle and change things? And then I have a few examples of challenges and potential of New Mexico. That is what I'm hoping that we hear a lot more in the talks today. So what is climate change? If you read the news today, this is what you see. Disaster after disaster. It's getting hotter, it's flooding, the hurricanes are coming, the tornadoes are coming, everything is just going awful. And that is one part of climate change. In science, technically what it is that the global temperature is going up. And what I want to really make a difference here is between the weather changes in one summer or 1 week compared to the overall long-term trend. The long-term trend is what matters here. And we are talking about 1.2 degrees Celsius. It's not much. But if the average temperature rises that much, the likelihood of hotter events becomes bigger. It's like you are changing your deck of cards, that you are changing the ratio between black and red cards. And suddenly you are having more and more red because you are shifting a little bit. Why does it matter? It matters because it has feedbacks to other processes in the earth. So I am just giving an example here about the water cycle. So what happens in the water cycle if the climate gets hotter? The atmosphere suddenly can hold more water because hotter air can hold more water vapor. So you get increased evaporation and you get more moisture in the air. And that changes the whole climate system and feedbacks to all kinds of things. So just rising the temperature in the Earth system is not, the consequences are not as simple as just rising the temperature. They are actually, as we see in the headlines in the news, they are way more complex. What are we expecting to see in the climate change? These are graphs of predictions for increased temperature or temperature and precipitation in two different climate scenarios, RCP 2.6 and RCP 8.5. The 2.6 is basically kind of a moderate scenario that we are actually doing actions and taking carbon dioxide out of the air and trying to do something. RCP 8.5 is kind of the most extreme. Let's do nothing and what happens. But in both scenarios, what we see, it's going to get hotter everywhere. It's going to get especially hotter at high latitudes. And it's going to get a hotter sea surface. There was just news yesterday about the sea temperature in Florida going over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That is insane. Precipitation is a slightly more difficult parameter to predict in the climate models because cloud formation is not very well, it's understood, but it's very difficult to put into the models. So, but all the climate models still predict that wetter areas are getting wetter, especially in the higher latitudes. Drier areas are getting drier, where we actually grow our crops. and then they are predicting more extreme rainfall events, which means, especially if you think about our soils and our systems here, more runoff, because the soil doesn't infiltrate very well. So what causes climate change? We know all about the greenhouse effect. And the important part here is that we are getting solar radiation at low wavelengths going into the system. But, and then some of the wavelengths are low, no, I said it wrong. We are getting solar radiation at very high frequency wavelengths basically going in. And some of that is reflected directly depending on the albedo, reflected out, but some of it is converted to heat to the surfaces and heat to the system, and then it changes the wavelength. You are getting longer wavelengths suddenly, and then the gases in the atmosphere start trapping, like the glass in the greenhouse traps the long wavelengths. So we are basically looking at the wavelength conversion here. And this graph or picture on the right is from the internet. They very nicely explain it. I hate the picture because they only talk about carbon. There are other gases as well that are greenhouse gases like methane, nitrous oxide, water vapor, and these are also important. And now we can get to their impact on the warming potential. So this is, when we calculate warming potential of different greenhouse gases, we have to take into account their lifetime in the atmosphere, how long they stay there, as well as their absorption potential for the radiation. So what we have here is that a plot of global warming potential of CO2, methane, N2O, and water vapor. And there I have labeled their sources, biggest sources on top, and then we have an estimate for 20 years and 100 years. And what you can see, this is all scaled to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is 1 here. So what you see is that methane is, in 20-year scale, is not quite 100 times, but almost 100 times more potent. But methane also disappears from the atmosphere within 100 years. Its half-life is about 50 years, so you get less in potential in 100 years. N2O, 270 times. And it actually stays quite well in the 100-year period in the atmosphere. Water vapor is sometimes you hear people talking about water vapor is a greenhouse gas. We have omitted it in the climate science, and why don't we deal with the water vapor? One reason is that it is really difficult to control. Controlling evaporation and the heating environment increases water vapor, and it also will have a lot of feedbacks. It has a feedback also because cloud formation and clouds actually reflect more radiation out. So it can have a cooling effect, and in this estimate, water vapor has been put into a cooling effect because of increased cloud cover. But it's depending on how you calculate, you can get a positive or negative effect from the water vapor. Why are we so much focusing on the CO2? This graph is from the IPCC report, and if you look at up there, this is basically the estimated radiative forcing of different aspects that influence climate change. CO2 is the biggest one, what they estimate in this, and that is because CO2 is so abundant in the atmosphere. It has caused the most warming so far, that's the estimate. It stays in the atmosphere, and many of the greenhouse gases, like methane, eventually change to CO2 when they go through the chemical cycle. So that's why CO2 is very important. And when you look at it, it almost has, even if its potential, warming potential is less than methane, it almost has double the effect because of how much it is. It is also something that humans have been putting into the atmosphere more. We have been putting all the other things here too, but a lot, and it is something that is relatively easy to try to control if you want to. What can we do then to control emissions? The thinking behind all of this is that controlling the emissions is the most important way of mitigating climate change, controlling CO2 emissions. Here I have contributors to the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere by industrial sectors. The energy and heat sector basically contributes the most. The first graph shows that, then the second graph is basically taking the top part of it without the electricity and heat, so that you can see how things are distributed a little bit there. Transportation is the second biggest. Industry comes after that, then buildings, and then other things. Other things include agriculture and anything that wasn't really mentioned in this graph. And basically the thinking here is that to get to net zero emissions by 2050, which is a goal for many governments, many coalitions, in the US, in Europe, everywhere. What you need to do is we need to have a surge of renewable energy and zero emission technology. We need to stop building coal-fired power plants by 2035. No new sales of fossil fuel boilers. I know California is going that way, kind of thinking about going that way already. New buildings, zero carbon. They need to be net zero carbon buildings. And electricity will be the basis of the energy. What would this need from all of us? It requires the worldwide investment in clean energy that is 3 times of what we are investing now by 2030. 2030 is only 7 years from now. I'm not sure if the political will is to really do this, but this is the estimate what is needed to happen. Here are some more figures about what people think about the reduction of emissions. So there I have the 2019 graph of the US emissions and the European strategy. Why I have the European strategies, it was easier to find in the internet than, than the US strategy. So, but here you see basically in the European strategy for each sector, for power, industry, transport, residential, agriculture, and total, how much reduction in the emission needs to happen for zero carbon. And, or if we get to the low carbon targets in 2050. This is old enough that it says by 2005, 7% in power, 20% in industry. I don't think that happened. And then by 2030, we are halving pretty much everything now in 7 years. So that is great goals, but we need the revolution. So what else can we do instead of trying to reduce the emissions, because our expertise in this room is mostly not reducing emissions necessarily. So there is this other acronym, CCUS, that has come up and is talked about a lot, and that is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So the idea is that we can capture carbon from the atmosphere with different means and convert it to different things, like fuels, chemicals, building materials. We can use it for yield boosting in agriculture. We can make solvents, heat transfer fluids, and other things out of carbon dioxide. Or we can store it underground. Nice idea. There are already big carbon capture systems set up, for example, in Iceland and elsewhere. The problem is that the utilization side is not really developed. We are still searching for where to put the carbon safely underground. We still have beverage industry as the biggest consumer for CO2, and it's only so much soda you can drink. And then the CO2 comes up again in the atmosphere. There are nice, interesting developments coming out from, for example, using CO2 for making concrete. And those are promising, but it has to be scaled up in a really, really big way. I have circled around the yield boosting because that is something that the soil carbon and plant, that's kind of more my field of expertise, and probably most of you are mostly working on that field too. So let's look at that one in a little bit more detail. This is the International Energy Agency's estimate for the relative impact and benefits of these different CCUS methods. So we have basically high relative climate impact and high impact on CO2 in the atmosphere with the direct storage. Yes, you can take the carbon if you put it in the soil, it's out, however long it lasts in the storage. Then we have a high impact in the fuels as well, but in terms of how much carbon it can take out of the system, but it may have a medium impact in the climate because of the time scale in which it comes back to the atmosphere. Funnily enough, the polymers yields boosting in greenhouses and all that is in the low corner. And that comes to the time scales. So why are we actually interested in looking into that one? And the reason is that this technology is already available. We know how to do this. It also has more economic, more potential for creating economic opportunities because it provides work, it provides new technology or new applications of technology, it provides revenue. You are producing something when you are growing crops. It can also resolve other challenges like soil health, microclimates, and food security. The images down here, what I have are on the left is thermal camera images of a forest. And what you see in the blue in the middle are the broad-leaved trees, when they are transpiring and they cool the microclimate, their leaves are cooler than the air. So it impacts the microclimate. It's very important in cities. The right-hand side figure is from a simulation with the Zurich Technical University for Zurich City. And what you see is the red areas are basically the railway station and everything is concrete and asphalt. And the greener areas are either the lake or the parks. So vegetation has a huge impact in the urban heat islands and how they develop. So that's the other potential of using the nature-based solution or yield boosting as our solution. And I want to mention that in that estimate we saw in the previous slide, there's a lot of uncertainty in how the impact of the yield boosting and nature-based solution is calculated, because it matters how we do it. So we basically have two aspects of the nature-based solutions. We either have the vegetation can take the carbon up, or we can try to store it in the soil and hopefully combine both. The challenge with the vegetation taking it up are the timescales. Grasses and annuals, they usually give the carbon back to the air in about a yearly timescale. The trees can hold up to it for hundreds of years unless they burn in the fire. Currently it's estimated that the global stock in the carbon stock in vegetation is 466 gigatons of carbon. In the soil there is way more. There is 2,000 gigatons. And in the soil it is in the kind of the topmost layer. There the timescales change completely. The topmost layer circulates carbon really fast, but the deeper you go, the longer it stays. The challenges are that the mineralization of the carbon in the soil is a big knowledge gap, exactly what processes and how it's controlled. And most studies, if you look at the literature, talk about this huge potential of soil carbon storage, but they talk about only the potential of uptake. They don't talk about the time scale at which it's released back and where it stays. So what do we do about elevated CO2 boosting effect on plants? Here I have a graph that presents a schematic of how much the plant growth increases as a function of increasing CO2 concentration. And we are going from like 200 ppm to 1800. The current day, they say that normally is 300, we are actually at 400 nowadays. But you see it's a bell curve. So you basically have generally a boosting effect in the middle, and then the growth decreases on both sides. The yield boosting has its advantages. It does increase photosynthesis, it increases growth rate, it reduces the time it takes for the crops to mature. So you can get more generations in 1 year, in principle. And it also has been shown to have effects on transpiration and increasing plant water use efficiency, which would be excellent. Disadvantages, if you think about doing this in the greenhouse, is that there is a higher production cost. You need to get the CO2 from somewhere, and you need to seal your greenhouse, and you need to manage it in a different way to hold on to the CO2 and enable that. Some plants may not show a positive response because the supplemental effect of the CO2 depends on other factors, and for example, nutrient availability and other things. And generally, the supplementation is more beneficial for younger plants. Plants that grow more benefit from more of the CO2. And if you go really excessive with this one, higher levels of CO2 become toxic to plants, and they are also toxic to people. There are at the moment studies in the literature kind of going to about 1200 ppm in the greenhouse conditions, and that's 800 is considered still kind of safe for the workers to be there. But after that, there is no regulation really. This is just what the studies are saying. So if we look into a little bit more detail about this one and put it into the ecosystem context, like now going from the greenhouse outside to the field, yes, we know that the photosynthesis increases with increasing CO2 concentration, but the shape of the curve and the amplitude depends on the plant species and the conditions where they grow. Similar to respiration, we know that respiration goes up with increasing CO2 concentration, basically because there is just more stuff in ecosystems to decompose. But where the curve goes and whether it plateaus in the end, we actually really don't know. And it depends on where you are and how you do things. One example of this, how it matters where you are, is that in the United States we have this word bad word, tilling. Tilling is bad for climate. It releases more CO2. Then I talked with colleagues from Norway who have a really peaty soil that is high organic carbon content. It's all the time wet. It rains almost all the time. No effect of tilling on the greenhouse gas emissions. So again, it depends on where you are and what your system is about. If we look at the carbon sequestration of forest ecosystems, currently it's estimated that forest ecosystems are sequestering about 4 gigatons per year. This is in the photosynthetic uptake, minus the respiration in the current system. If we look at preservation practices, just like not cutting the forest or replanting after cutting and taking good care of the soil, there is a potential of increasing the sequestration capacity 3 to 7 times. And if we did that one, that would account for about 20 to 75% of the annual CO2 emissions, and annual emissions are 37 gigatons per year now from the global industrial and all the partners. I was once interviewed for a European newspaper about the potential of reforesting Saharan desert to sequester carbon, whether that would be feasible and whether that would be great. So I pulled out some numbers or estimated some numbers here. The Saharan desert, if we just take the carbon sequestration capacity of a tropical forest, Sahara used to be a tropical forest, okay, let's make it back. It's about 11 tons of CO2 per hectare per year, and Sahara is about 9 million square kilometers. So if I calculate that one, we get about 9.9 gigatons of CO2 per year if it was a tropical forest. 9.9, 37, yeah. We are at 4 at the moment, so it would a little bit more than double our current capacity if we could do that. Is it feasible? These pictures are from a project with the Groasis that initiated this let's build green barriers in Sahara. They made this kind of special watering systems, pots for the trees to start growing in so that they could survive. There was some success. They started in 2014, there were some trees surviving. Not all that they planted survived. The sand was taking over a lot. So this solution would require a lot of pampering of the plants. And I was actually like hypothesizing or wondering if taking biomass that decomposes in areas like wood debris and all that to Sahara would be a better solution, because if the logs of wood were buried in the sand, it would be just one transportation cost, and then they degrade there very slowly because the climate is so dry and so even if it's hot, it's so dry that decomposition rate is really low. And that's what you can see here when our trees die in the PJ savanna. The logs are there for hundreds of years. In agricultural soils, carbon sequestration potential basically, that is an interesting question, because agriculture reduces carbon reserves in the topsoil. And that is because we turn it around. This comes to the tilling question, and Norway and northern Scandinavia might be an anomaly in the world where the tilling doesn't matter as much as anywhere else. At the moment, 50% of vegetated land surface has been converted to croplands. If the human population is increasing and we need to increase that amount, we are going to lose soil carbon. The main carbon sequestration from annual crops comes from how you manage the process, how you produce them, and how you manage the soil afterwards. And in this graph underneath, this is a study by Zomer et al. In 2017 showing basically a medium scenario of the practices, how you manage the soil, how it could impact the increase in soil carbon in different agricultural areas. You can see the more is the darker color. I want to just point out we are talking about in this graph tons of carbon, not gigatons or megatons. So there is potential, but because of the agriculture and how you do it, the potential is slightly lower than in the others. The carbon fertilizers and effect of crops production vary by region. This is a map about the fertilizers and effect estimated for 100 ppm of CO2 increase, and you can see that in the lightest colors here are now the best ones. And you can see that it is basically 22% increase at best, estimated. The variation is due to that the effect of elevated CO2 depends on the crop. C3 and C4 plants react differently. Generally, C3 plants are more susceptible to increasing their growth if you increase CO2 than C4. Yep. So this is increasing carbon concentration in the atmosphere. So the elevated CO2.
So you say carbon fertilization, still not getting it. Are you talking about fertilizing with carbon-based fertilizers, or?
Thank you for clarifying that, because the terminology, this is elevated CO2. Yeah, people, this is again, like we use CCUS, carbon farming, nature-based solutions. That is all the carbon sequestration. Elevated CO2, carbon fertilization, yield boosting. This is all the terms that kind of at the same. Does it make sense now? Yeah. Yeah, I'm not consistent with my terminology, as you can see, so feel free to ask. Yeah, so what we basically have is that the crop species, what is the most prominent in each region, affects this map a lot. The other thing that affects it is the precipitation and aridity. The impact of elevated CO2 reduces the more drier conditions you are in, because the water becomes the limiting factor of your growth. There are some unintended consequences of the carbon elevated CO2. I was going to say carbon fertilization, but now I caught myself. So some of them are positive and some of them can be negative. So one effect that is interesting in addition to the increased water use efficiency is that there is some evidence for increased nitrogen use efficiency, which would be in a certain way great. Less fertilization needed. And what we have here is basically the Rubisco content and how elevated CO2 is affecting it from a review article for generally crops. Okay, a variety of crops. Trees, a variety of trees. Legumes and grasses, and you see basically that the effect is, for trees there is not much effect, but for crops there definitely is a significant effect in the elevated CO2 for how much nitrogen they actually use for producing photosynthesis. In production in photosynthesis. On the right-hand side is a graph about the evapotranspiration effects of different crops. And what I want to point out here is that the evaporation, influence of water use efficiency and evaporation rates of the elevated CO2 depends on if you are in a well-irrigated system or not, and if you are low in nitrogen or not. So but generally there is a, yeah.
Would you explain phase experiments?
Yes. Phase experiments are basically where a big DOE project where there were in field conditions open-top chambers where the plants were fertilized with CO2, elevated CO2. They increased CO2. The concentration they went to at maximum was 600 ppm. So now we are talking about relatively little elevation above the ambient, and then they studied all kinds of things in those. The phase sites covered forest, spruce forest, mixed deciduous forests, as well as croplands. And that is the most famous experiment in the US about elevated CO2. And the reason why there haven't been awfully many others is that elevating CO2 in field conditions is really expensive and not really like feasible for a production thing, but for science things, it's. Did you get what you needed? Excellent. So then more unintended consequences, when people have been doing this one in the greenhouses, what we see is that elevated CO2 alters vegetable nutrient content. And what happens is basically the plants will start having more carbon and less nitrogen. And it changes their antioxidants and it changes their minerals. Basically it reduces the mineral contents. So your food becomes less rich in the minerals. And now, okay, it depends on which crop and how you do it, again. But that is the general trend. So then, what do we know about the combined effects of elevated CO2 and climate change? We know that on the left side that the net photosynthetic rate depends on temperature, and the elevated CO2 can make plants less less responsive to high temperatures, so that they can do photosynthesis in higher temperatures, at least some plants, but not all plants. And we generally have always, photosynthesis goes, as a function of light and temperature, it goes up and then it goes down. If there is too much, you don't get cannot do as much, and if there's too little, you cannot do much, and there is a plateau in between. And there are not awfully many studies that look at the combinations of these. It's way easier to study one factor than a 2 or 3 factor, or manage a 2 or 3 factor experiment. So that's kind of a big knowledge gap that more research is needed for us to understand how the interactions go. The other aspect that I want to point out here is the graph in the bottom. The growth conditions influence plant growth form. And we know very little about how exactly climate change factors influence these. We know that plants usually grow more roots if they are mildly stressed because of drought. Then you get, if your photosynthesis rate doesn't go up, you get less yield or less growth above ground because the carbon budget doesn't change. Oh, how far we can change the photosynthetic capacity is one big question that people are looking at, and there are hypotheses that we can still push it up, but also hypotheses that especially for C-free plants or we might be at a saturation, that we cannot push it easily up anymore with the biochemical and gene manipulation methods. So and of course the farmer would like to have the high yield few roots. But for carbon sequestration in the soil, actually the deeper roots can influence more. So the balancing of this one is going to be, again, a very, very complex question. Then I'm going to go a little bit to the yield boosting in greenhouse settings, because one idea that is flowing around in the DOE complex is this idea that if we have a power plant that produces CO2, we could capture the CO2 right at the power plant. There are already methods for that to do it for point sources. Then we clean the CO2 so that we can push it into a greenhouse that produces food. That would resolve a food desert problem in some areas. And if we get a bigger production there, then that could be used for biofuel for the cars and food for the people that work in the power plant. So you would have a circular economy in the places where the power plants are. Not too bad, in principle. If we look at the potential of what this could actually do to us, is I calculated for a very small greenhouse, 18 square feet greenhouse, just what people could have. Basically, if we have a typical crop CO2 uptake rate about 10 micromoles per square meter per second, and they grow crops all year round with that surface area there, this increased CO2 anything between 600 to 1200 ppm could increase the crop yield by 10 to 70%. So we could create a sink of 1.7 to 2.7 tons of CO2 in a year. Not bad. It would be actually beneficial in many other ways, even if the CO2 eventually goes quite quickly back to the atmosphere, because when we consume the food, it will do that. There are options to increasing the potential. One is vertical agriculture. Vertical agriculture can easily increase the growing surface area by 5 times or even more. People are also investigating different ways of boosting the productivity of plants, for example, with microbes. That's something that my colleagues at LANAL do quite a bit, trying to do microbes that could increase the growth, and that could be used in this kind of a system as well. How about the soil carbon sequestration then? I went through the literature a little bit, and the graph on the left is just a schematic. The scale is not completely correct, but it's demonstrating that what we have is for the soil carbon sequestration under elevated CO2, whether elevated CO2 increases or decreases different processes in that. It's an open question. There are studies that show that you get an increase in respiration with elevated CO2, but also studies that show there is a decrease. Similarly, you get an increased soil organic matter content and a decreased one. And the mineral litter decomposition rate can increase or decrease with elevated CO2. So we are again like, okay, depending on the system, how you do it. There are also different kind of reasons for the increase and decrease that come in the literature. Some people say that the higher respiration rate is due to easier and more material to decompose. Some people say that the decrease is due to that it's easier to actually store. And then because the plants when they grow faster in the elevated CO2, they use more of the nitrogen. Then there is less nitrogen for the microbiome, and that can affect how the carbon cycle changes. So again, we are like, okay, the specifics and the context matters like crazy here. One really interesting result from our own study here in Southwest is that the microbiome, how the microbiome processes the carbon during litter decomposition depends on where it originated from, depending on the nitrogen deposition or nitrogen availability. So what we did was that we collected soils in a elevation gradient as well as a gradient with increasing distance from human habitat in New Mexico and southern Colorado. And then we used those microbiomes in a mesocosm experiment and with a blue grama litter, and they decomposed the litter, and we measured how much CO2 and how much DOC was produced. And what happens basically is that the less remote you are from a human habitat where the microbiome originated, the more CO2 you produce. So the more nitrogen available increases CO2 production during the litter decomposition from the microbiome and reduces the DOC production, and DOC is what we would expect to go to the soil so that it could be stored. The graph on the right side shows we plotted this data against the annual nitrogen deposition, and we again have a decreasing trend. The amount of DOC decreases the more nitrogen you have available in the soil in which the microbiome originated. So basically nitrogen availability changes the microbiome functionality and how it processes the carbon. Some challenges and potential for New Mexico, because we have very special soils here, are very special systems. We have very alkaline soil, we have very hard packed soil, high clay content. So we definitely are going to have challenges with water availability. We have that already. We also have a really high radiative load. And here at the bottom I have a little picture from the internet about an oak tree. You see trees with red leaves or plants with red leaves here in the juvenile state in the spring, and that is because the radiation load is too high. So they cannot use all the radiation for photosynthesis. They put on sunscreen. The red color is the sunscreen. And if you need to do that too much, your productivity goes down. We definitely are going to struggle with heat. We have been already struggling with that one this summer. We also have a very especially low soil organic matter content. It has a potential that we have a large sink. So in principle, we could actually store way more carbon in our soils than there is now, if we could manage it. So in that sense, it's good. For growing things, it's challenging, at least in the beginning, because getting anything to grow in a soil that doesn't have very little microbes and very little infiltration and anything, that's hard. And I have a graph here about biochar pellets, because we have had a project with Trollworks from Silver City about testing their biochar in a greenhouse setting. So I'm hoping that in this meeting here we will have discussions about different kinds of soil amendments that people can do and their effects. What we are expecting for New Mexico with climate change is, of course, increasing temperature. So we are expecting an increase from 2.5 to 5.5 Fahrenheit by 2041 to 2070. And yes, that's a lot. It's going to get hotter. We are also expecting a reduction in the amount of snow that is coming. And what's special about our system, that actually for the ecosystems here, the snow matters more than the rain. Because when we have the monsoon, yes, it's important, but it rains so hard that runoff is huge. But the snow actually infiltrates better to the soil, and it's very important. And on the right-hand side, we have the projected snow equivalent for New Mexico and Colorado in the future. From the first decrease, 1 to 4% is between 2006 and 2035, and then it increases like crazy. The last one is for 2070 to 2099. So New Mexico first does better than Colorado, but then it's getting worse than Colorado in the prediction. And the snow is going to be disappearing of snow is going to be a big effect on all of our ecosystems. This leads us to kind of microclimates, which is a really, really big feature in New Mexico. We have vegetation on certain sides of mountains because the wind blows that way and rains more there, and then it dries out in the desert in the valleys. San Juan Valley is a very good example of this kind of a system. We also have local scales. Vegetation and the surfaces influence the microclimate very heavily. We can observe this one, or we can try to engineer it to help our systems. And one way this kind of a microclimate influences the whole global or local cycle of water and carbon is the amount of vegetation. So these are famous figures from the droughts in the early 2000s in between Los Alamos and Santa Fe. This is a very famous big studies in the forest science side. And what we had was basically we had a drought in 2002, and after that in 2004 all the pinyon pine trees died. There have been studies looking at why it was the pinyon pines that died and not the junipers, and how this works. But what this does to the water cycle of the system is that PJ without P has less carbon uptake than it did. It also has less transpiration because the plants are basically pumps from the soil to the atmosphere. So we basically have less local moisture, and we get less clouds locally. So now with this kind of system, if we have less green biomass, we are relying more and more on the monsoon for the moisture to come from the oceans and the wind direction to pushing it. If we have local moisture, then you can create local thunderclouds, and the cycle is smaller and you get back. This year we had a lot of rain in the early summer, at least in Los Alamos. I don't know, not here. No. What we are seeing now is in Los Alamos is that, okay, even if the weather is dry, we are getting teeny tiny thunderstorms because the mountain vegetation is so lush. I have been here for 15 years and I have never seen it so lush as this year. So that's how the local cycle matters a lot in creating a local circulation. What we can do in New Mexico are different kind of combinations of kind of engineering microclimates. And one thing that I have been really interested in is the agrivoltaics. Agrivoltaics is basically agriculture under solar panels, producing PV electricity and agriculture at the same time. The challenges in that one is that it's been studied in the East Coast and the West Coast. They are way more moist climate. They are more cloudy. The biggest challenge they say that are, okay, you need to build your solar panels so that you can actually have tractors going in between so that you can manage the agriculture. And the shading is a big problem. I'm hypothesizing that in New Mexico, actually, the shading might help because we already have a huge load of radiation and we are so dry. So it would create a microclimate under the solar panels that actually cools the solar panels off and reduces the evaporation from the plants and the surface where your plots are. So this experiment we did last summer with the Trollworks at the El Rito solar panels. We had 4 little plots where we were looking at how biochar could influence the growth of tomato plants under solar panels. So we had a plot with biochar and without biochar under solar panels, and then the controls outside the solar panels in the same system. The biochar was mixed with compost because this soil is an old arroyo bed. It's super rocky and super sandy. So we had to amend it a little bit more. And then we grew the tomatoes, and then we measured them. These solar panels tilt with the sun. So we get the shading only in the afternoon on this one. And what we found out in this one is that the biochar actually helped create the soil plant system under the solar panels so that we got higher tomato yield. We had only so few plants that the statistical significances are not significant, but that was basically the tendency. And the plants grew better under the solar panels with that. It also increased the soil moisture retention, the biochar, under the solar panels, and it just created a better environment. The effects were tiny, but very, very promising. So we launched a bigger experiment this summer. Oh well, we planted the plants and the prairie dogs moved in. Prairie dogs moved in. So yes, so we lost all our plants last week. and now we are looking into alternatives for to plant instead of the tomatoes because the prairie dogs really like the tomatoes. So these are kind of aspects. They have fencing around there, and last year there were no prairie dogs even nearby. So real life. What else can we do? So there are some other wild ideas floating around. What can we do about the climate change? How about if we wrap everything in tinfoil and increase albedo? Fantastic. But scientists are actually thinking about along these ways and trying to produce really white paint that reflects 98% of the radiation back. And there are benefits of that one. Yes, reduces energy for cooling if you paint your roof white. It's easy to apply. You just put white paint. Why don't we paint all the roads white? It improves usually living conditions, especially in urban settings for people. It increases, if we increase worldwide albedos in urban roofs and paved surfaces, the impact of the negative impact of the radiating forcing would be equivalent to 22 to 40 gigatons of CO2. And if you remember the figure from the previous slides, 37 gigatons was the current emissions. So this could actually have a big impact. Would it change other things? It might change the microclimate and it might change the circulation if everybody did it. So again, we are in the place that we don't know the unintended consequences of exactly what to do. So at kind of an ending message here, what I want to get us out with is that many little drops make the stream. What we are doing with the soil carbon and with the yield boosting and all kinds of other things, it is still important, even if we currently estimate the influence quite as small. I would not want to live in a city like this, that we need to actually have our buildings underground to escape the heat and then try to grow something in some kind of reflective solar panel spheres outside to eat. That would be miserable. It would be like COVID bubbles all the time around. So how can we make our environment with every little contribution better? And that's what I'm really looking forward to hearing and discussing with you all today. These are the topics of our talks, and I am looking forward to every single one and hearing your opinions and your thoughts about all this. Thank you.